the recording right now. Um, and we'll do a minute or two of just intro, and then hopefully others will join in. But yeah, so thanks everyone for coming late, and for I guess the entire semester of CS195, and for working through everything. So for the last lecture, we have James Allworth, who is currently his title is the head of innovation at Cloudflare. Many of you probably know Cloudflare as a company that provides a variety of internet services. Primarily, I know a few people have used them as a CDN of various sorts. But I think the cool thing is that aside from having a career in tech, James hosts or co-hosts a semi-regular podcast called Exponent, where the topics are very much in the spirit of CS185, tech, how it affects the world, a bit of a mix of just the legal side, the policy side, the implications of business decisions. And then before that, and how sort of the title of the talk came to be, James was at the Harvard Business School and got to work with Professor Clayton Christensen, where together they co-wrote a book called How Will You Measure Your Life, which came out of the work that Clayton Christensen did as a professor in the business school. And I think James will speak to a little bit more of that. But yeah, last spring, this happened sort of right as right as we're about a month into lockdown, and no one really had an idea what was going on. And I thought it ended up being a really timely talk. And I think it is just as timely now that there is a year later. I think a bit of optimism in the world around seeing the end of COVID. So timely for a different reason, but timely nonetheless. So thank you for coming again, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for having me. It's an honor speaking to all you folks for what is the last class of CS195. I also want to thank you for so many of you, I realize, sitting up late or later than you normally would. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned just beforehand, I'm actually in Singapore at the moment. So I'm usually based in the Bay Area, but I'm here in Singapore with work at the moment. Cloudflare needed someone on this side of the world, and this was back last December when we were still in the thick of the pandemic, and an opportunity to jet across to the other side of the Pacific seemed too good to pass up. So here I am. As I mentioned before we started, I'd really like to make this a little bit more interactive. But before we do that, I think there are a couple of things that I wanted to touch on. I realize that we're in the middle, or maybe in the middle, maybe it's the beginning of the end of the pandemic. And I realize that lots of you folks, some of you are going to be graduating, some of you may have a couple more years left, one more year, a couple more years left. I kind of wanted to use a little bit of this time to perhaps provide some perspective on where things are at with the pandemic and how this fits into your life. One of the things that we did with How Will You Measure Your Life that I co-wrote with Clay, one of the principles of that is taking these ideas from business and seeing if they're generalizable lessons that can be learned, that can be applied and provide wisdom to how we think about decisions in life. And I think there are a couple of things that we can use to figure out how to approach things given the very uncertain state of the world at the moment. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the book, and some of the lessons from the book. And then once we've gone through that, open it up. Happy to talk about Exponent, topics from there, topics you guys are grappling with. Happy to talk about Cloudflare too. Whatever it is, however you'd like to use the time. So I guess let's start with the pandemic, and let's start with like a conversation around a business that some of you may be familiar with, but it actually may be a little bit before many of your times, which is Blockbuster. Blockbuster was a very, very famous video rental store that was very popular in the US, probably peaked around 20 years ago, around the turn of the century. And it had done phenomenally well. They built stores out across the entire country. They had around the 2000s, I think they had somewhere in the order of $5 billion in revenue. They were within a mile of something like 80 to 90% of the US population. Very, very successful business. And of course, there was a little bit of a fly in the ointment, which was at the time Netflix. And Netflix was started around that time, and investors started to worry a little bit about Netflix. And they would consistently ping Blockbuster management and say, "Hey, there's this video rental company that's doing deliveries by mail. We really want you to pay attention to it." And it was so interesting. The Blockbuster executives were disparaging on a regular basis. And I mean, it's easy to look back now and think, man, these guys are complete idiots. They should have seen it. They actually had an opportunity to acquire the company for a few $100 million and they passed on it. And again, like, what were they thinking? But again, I would put it to you that these were smart people running a well-executed company. Something was causing them to view the world this way. And so I want to actually put us, like, walk a mile in the shoes of the Blockbuster executives and see what we can learn. Around the 2000s, like I mentioned, that they had revenues somewhere in the order of $5.5 billion. And the margins that they were getting in terms of like the amount of cost to revenue, so a very important number, gross margins were somewhere in the order of 66%. Netflix, in comparison, around the time that this started to become a big issue for investors and that they were asking the Blockbuster management how they were doing, their revenue somewhere in the order of $150 million. But worse than that, they had margins that were almost half of what Blockbuster was making. It was somewhere in the order of 36%, if I remember correctly. And these numbers are important because these numbers were the vantage point that Blockbuster executives were looking at the nature of the problem. They are basically hearing lots of pressure from investors to say, hey, there's this business that's springing up. You need to do something about it. And they would be like, okay, well, I'm sitting on the vantage point of this big successful business, and my job is to deliver numbers to Wall Street. I need to make sure that when I report my quarterly earnings, that they're going in the right direction, where margins are up, revenues are up. And I look at this smaller business and it's like, it doesn't look this attractive. And so if you're a Blockbuster executive, what you're basically thinking about is like, what do I do? What's the decision I make when I hear this? And it's, well, I basically need to invest to create a competitor to what Netflix is doing. And it's like, okay, let's think about the decision trees if we do this. We can take all this money, and it's either going to fail or it's going to succeed. If it fails, well, we've lost all the money that's involved in investing in it. That's not a good look. But we've also gone and kind of blessed the competitor and said, there's actually something here. So that doesn't feel too good. But what's also interesting is it doesn't look that attractive if it succeeds. It's like, we have all these stores that we've invested in. We have all these people. We deliver 66% margins and all these revenue. Like, the fundamental business model that Netflix is proposing, this has got half the margins. It's going to take out our existing stores and we're going to replace it with something that's half as profitable effectively as what we've got right now. And that's going to make it really hard for us to hit our numbers. So looking down the decision path, fail doesn't look too good, succeed doesn't look too good. So I guess we're not going to do anything. But of course, like, as we know, looking back on the situation, this wasn't really the case at all. The choice that they were really facing was they could choose not to invest, or choose to invest, or choose not to invest. And if it fails, well, then it fails. But if it succeeds, then they actually have a business, because the choice they were facing was invest to create something that will cannibalize themselves, invest to create a business that actually had a future. If they fail to do this, their choice is not continuing with the business that they already have, but that business that they already have will cease to exist. And that choice is really important, right? It's this vantage point. They were sitting on top of a business that was wildly successful, and they could only view the world through that lens. Whereas the Netflix folks, they were sitting on top of the world from a vantage point of not having any business at all. And if you're sitting on top of a $5.5 billion business with 66% margins, then a smaller business with worse margins doesn't look that attractive. But if you're sitting on top of a business that's effectively nothing, you don't have an existing business to defend, then any opportunity whatsoever looks great. And it's this insight that I think is valuable in the context of figuring out how to think about the pandemic. Your expectations around what it is that you're going to do really color the decisions you make and how you think about the world. Like, these executives thought they had a choice to just continue on their merry way, doing what they were doing. Their expectations were, oh, we can just run this business into perpetuity. We'll just keep growing, and all we have to do is just keep doing the same thing that we've always done. And the alternative, like, given this is going to continue off on steady state forever, alternatives to this don't look that attractive. But of course, that wasn't the reality of the situation. That business was going to die. It was going to get eaten alive by competition. And if they didn't invest to create the competitor that would cannibalize their own business, then somebody else would. A lot of you probably came into the past couple of years with a lot of visions around what you were going to be doing in the future. Some of you may have been going overseas on exchange. Some of you, it's probably starting to look a little bit better in terms of the US, like economic growth is starting to pick up, but there may be jobs that you were thinking about pursuing, or industries, or time off after school that you were thinking about taking, where you travel the world, or whatever it might be, that you had as an expectation around what it was that you were going to do. And in comparison to that, this feeling like, this is what you are going to do, like what you're doing now, which is still under degrees of lockdown. I won't say complete lockdown, but degrees of lockdown, it doesn't really feel as good. I think that one of the things that I would say is the folks, the companies, the people, the investors, whoever, even the countries that have dealt best with the pandemic, were the ones that, under a new set of circumstances where something new has arisen, they were the ones that were fastest able to let go of those expectations around how the world was going to be, and begin to accept that this is the way that the world actually is. You look at the countries that responded best. To characterize the United States point of view, or the government of the United States point of view, the whole way through, it was like, oh yes, this isn't going to be a big deal. It's just about to get better. And you compare that with places like in Singapore right now, and their response was, well, we're not sure. And then very quickly, they're like, this is very serious, and we need to take immediate action now, because if we don't take action now and we delay it any further, the cost of action in a month or 2 months is going to be exponentially greater to get these things under control. Those countries that were quickly able to recognize exactly what was going on and accept it, like let go of the visions of, oh, well, 2020 is going to be a rosy year and we have all this economic growth to look forward to, so on and so forth. Like, the ones who were most able to let go of those expectations, zero their expectations, come at the problem with a blank slate, the ones that were able to do that most quickly were the ones that were actually able to succeed in this new environment. And I think that's the parable of Netflix and Blockbuster. It's human beings have this tendency to kind of create expectations around the future, based on the past. And sometimes that serves us well, but as things change, and especially if they change quickly, just being able to accept the change quickly puts you in a position where you're better able to respond to that change. The longer you hang on to those set of beliefs around what it was that you were going to do, what it was that you thought the future might hold, the longer it actually takes you to accept the way the world is and then respond effectively, you're living in an imagined world. You're living in an imagined world that's just a projection of the past, as opposed to accepting reality the way that it is. And it doesn't serve you well in business, as the folks in Blockbuster learned. It doesn't serve you well as a country, as those countries who kind of denied the reality of what was happening with the pandemic because maybe it was an election year and this wasn't part of the election plan. And I'd say it doesn't serve you as individuals either. And it's probably not easy advice to hear. I imagine taking some time off and going and traveling overseas or whatever that might have been would have been great. But the sooner that you're able to accept, okay, it's different. I'm going to let go of what I thought I thought the world was going to be like, accept the way the world is, the sooner you'll actually be able to identify the opportunities that will emerge as a result of the world looking as different as it does right now. With that, I feel like that's kind of like the timely part of what I wanted to talk about. With that, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about the book that I worked with Professor Christensen on. So Clay was a pretty remarkable man. He actually passed away. He passed away early last year. I got to get into his class, and it was one of the most popular classes at Harvard Business School. And the idea behind this class was we were going to learn he was going to equip us with a whole bunch of theories to make us effective general managers. And where these theories came from was he surveyed the entire management literature out there, and he picked the ones that he thought would be most helpful to us, but were also based on this idea of good theory, causal theory. A lot of what is researched happens to be correlative, but there's an art to driving through to causality. And he believed that if students had a good grounding in this management theory, then they would have a toolkit with which to go out into the business world and make good decisions. And so the first one of these that we learn about is disruption, which is what Clay is famous for, the theory of disruption or disruptive innovation. But a number of the theories were much more, I guess, grounded or like relevant to just everyday life than that. So, for example, one of the things that we learned about was culture and how culture forms in an organization, or motivation, what motivates people and why. It's easy to think about business as this thing that's all about finance and accounting and chasing dollars. But I think fundamentally business is really about people. It's really about the people that work on your team, but also serving customers. And like having a good understanding of people equips you to be effective in the world of business. And so a lot of these theories were actually predicated on that. So each of the classes, what we would do is we would learn these theories and then we would apply it to a case. And that was a little bit different from most of the other HBS classroom classes, because most of it would just be, you get the case and then you try and figure out what to do. Clay would be, you get the case, but you also get the theory, which is a tool to help you figure out what to do in the instance of a case. Again, wildly popular class. I enjoyed it tremendously. But what was really powerful was the last day of class. And what Clay would do was he would write 3 questions up on the board. How can I find happiness in my relationships? How can I find happiness in my career? And how can I stay out of jail? And that last question was a little tongue-in-cheek, but Clay had a classmate by the name of Jeffrey Skilling, who, if you've heard of Enron, the failed oil trading company, went under because of like they effectively committed a huge amount of fraud. They were lying to investors and to the market. Clay knew Skilling during his time at HBS and said he was a good guy, but something sent him off the rails. And so, like, what could we take from the management theory to try and figure out how to prevent this happening when you were in the same shoes and like you were in the you were managing a business and you were faced with these decisions. And so what we would do on this last day of class is he would write those 3 questions up, and then he would write all the theories along the top that we'd studied, like what motivates people, what motivates employees, like how a culture forms in an organization, and so on. And yeah, it was incredibly powerful. And so I found myself using that as I got towards the end of my MBA, I found myself using some of the ideas in that class to figure out what I actually wanted to do after school. And it helped me realize that actually I didn't just want to go off and make lots of money. There were other things that were perhaps more important. And in fact, that thinking in that class was part of the reason when Clay asked me if I'd like to stick around and work with him, I jumped at the chance, because I realized this was actually something that I think I'd really enjoy. So what I want to do is actually take you through a couple of these theories now, and kind of help you understand the theory. So perhaps you might be able to use them in your own context, whether it's, I realize you're figuring out what to do. Perhaps you finish it, perhaps you're about to graduate and you're figuring out what to do about a career, or maybe that's not for another 12 or 24 months. But I think there's some value in these things, in understanding these things as you make decisions around what it is that you're going to do when you graduate. And the first one I've already kind of alluded to. Well, I've alluded to both, but the first one is motivation. I went into business school thinking motivation was one long spectrum from highly motivated to highly unmotivated. Like, I'm really into this or I'm really not. Now, it turns out that this is not the way that our minds work at all. And one of the most popular articles that Harvard Business Review has ever published is called One More Time, How Do I Motivate Employees? And it's by a guy by the name of Frederick Hertzberg. And anyway, what Hertzberg discovered through his research was that motivation is not one long spectrum from highly motivated to highly unmotivated. Actually, there are 2 separate things going on at once. The first one of these he terms hygiene factors, and hygiene factors are like, to give you the specifics of what they are. They are things that are more extrinsic in nature. So think how much you get paid, the prestige of the place that you're working at, the working conditions that you're working in. So is it safe or is it not? Is it comfortable? Is it not? What's really interesting about the hygiene factors is if they are lacking, you end up feeling extremely demotivated. Like, this is so frustrating. I don't like working here. This sucks, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting is as they become present, you don't experience a feeling of motivation towards what you're doing. Instead, there is simply an absence of demotivation. So it's interesting. These hygiene factors are things, if they are lacking, give you this gnawing sense of, I don't want to be here. This sucks. And the assumption will often be, if these are the things that are making me feel unhappy or dissatisfied with what I'm doing, then if I improve it, things are going to get so much better. They're going to go from, I don't hate this anymore to, I love this. And the other thing about hygiene factors is they tend to be very easy to measure. They're quite quantifiable. Like, this job pays me this much. This job pays me that much. This much is more than that much. So I'm going to go with this one because it's easy to measure. And it's easy to assume that these hygiene factors, but like they end up having an outsized role in decision-making for many people, especially when they come out of school, because I'm assuming most of you guys aren't making too much while you're in university, and not making any money kind of sucks. Like, it's actually nice to have some money to spend, especially money that you're making yourself. And so the feeling of like that dissatisfaction going away, it's easy to fall into the trap of, I'm just gonna keep focusing on money, and this feeling of the hygiene factors going away is good. And if I just keep optimizing here, then this is the right path. This is the way to make decisions. And it turns out not to be, because of these other set of factors. And these factors Hertzberg called motivators. Now, if they're lacking, you don't feel motivation, but as they become present, you feel more motivated towards what you're doing. Now, to ground it in terms of what these things are, this is like, do I believe in what it is that I'm doing? Am I learning new things? Am I being given the opportunity to shoulder responsibility? As these things become present, you go from feeling, I'm not really feeling any motivation, to like, I feel really motivated. I'm learning lots. I'm really loving what I'm doing. And so the insight for me here was like, these hygiene factors are things that I need to satisfy. Like, I need to get to a certain amount of money, and then I'm not so worried about it. And I need to make sure, obviously, that I'm working in a safe and reasonably comfortable office environment. But like, picking the office that's the most amazing is not going to make me love my job. Instead, it's going to be these other things, these motivators. They've got to be present. So what is it that really matters to me about what I'm doing? Like, where am I going to get an opportunity to learn new things that I'm interested in? Who's going to give me the opportunity to shoulder responsibility? Like, those are the things that I'm going to optimize for. There are other interesting insights that fall out of understanding that our brain works on these two different scales. So if you speak to folks who've perhaps worked in the military, or maybe school teachers from inner city schools, you get this sense that they're extremely conflicted about what they do. On one hand, they really love it. On the other hand, there's something about it that drives them crazy. They don't, and what it is they actually have the hygiene factors not very good. Like, it cannot be safe. It's not a comfortable working environment. They're often not paid very much, but they deeply, deeply believe in what they do. They really enjoy it, and they're given opportunities to learn and shoulder responsibility. And so you can kind of make sense of now what's going on in these people's brains. It's like, the motivators are really present, but the hygiene factors are really absent. And that's why these folks feel somewhat conflicted about their job. They love it on one hand and they hate it on the other. And that's what's going on. That obviously was research done in the context of employees, but the funny thing is, whether we're working for ourselves or we're working for another company, we can take this research and we can turn it around on ourselves. It can be something that we can use to like figure out how to think about how we approach the right job that's going to motivate us, that's going to feel really fulfilling. It's like, okay, I need to figure out what matters to me, and I need to figure out a level of income and whatever that's going to satisfy me. But it's like, I need to focus on optimizing these motivators, not focus on optimizing for the hygiene factors. That's what's going to make it so that like I really, really love what I do. And that was certainly my experience with the book. When I agreed to work with Clay, I had no idea we were going to be working on a book. I had not written anything long form since high school, so it was definitely a bit of a challenge coming up to speed on that. But it was also one of the most professionally fulfilling experiences that I had. And when I agreed to do it, like I mean, you come out of a MBA at Harvard Business School, like most of my friends were going off to do private equity or banking, getting paid absurd amounts of money, but they were also a little bit miserable. And I was almost certainly making less money than them, but I was having a much better time. And I think that was in part because like I had this understanding of motivation and I was using it to my advantage. They were still using the old version of motivation that I had, which was like, everything's weighted the same and it's one long spectrum, and it's just not the way our minds work. So the second one of these theories that I want to talk to you about is culture. And I also feel like this is a valuable thing for folks as you go out and you try and figure out an organization to work for, because the culture of the organization is really important to whether you're going to enjoy working in a specific environment or not. And let's figure out what culture actually means. Like when you hear culture thrown around in tech companies and in Silicon Valley, it's almost like, is there free food? Is there, what are the offices like? Do they give me a gym? Is there a foosball table? You know, all these types of things. And it turns out that's not culture. Those are artifacts of the culture. Excuse me. I've drunk too much bubbly Perrier and before we started, so you're gonna have to forgive me a little bit. So that's not culture. They're artifacts of the culture. So what's culture? Well, this is where Clay's understanding of all this research is so helpful. There's actually a scholar over on the other side of the US by the name of Edgar Schein, who works at MIT, and he is the preeminent scholar on organizational culture. And here's how Schein defines culture. Culture is the way in which organizations make decisions. So, okay, that's nice, but like ground that. What does that actually really mean? Let me give you an example. So the first time, let's say it's inside of a startup, the first time some problem comes along inside of a startup, nobody has any idea what to do, how to solve the problem. Like, this is the first time this group of people have encountered this problem. And so they have to figure out how to solve the problem. And let's say the problem is, well, we agreed to a deadline with a customer, but the product isn't ready yet. It's not met all our QA goals. Maybe it's got some bugs. Do we ship it or do we not? Okay. And what's going to happen is a whole bunch of people are going to come together and they're going to make this decision, and they're going to make the decision effectively one of two ways. They're going to ship it with some bugs, or they're going to wait for it to be above a certain standard. And that standard may be all the way up to like, it must be perfect before they ship. The first time they make that decision, the decision will have consequences. So maybe they ship it with the bugs and the customer doesn't care. They're just so happy to have the product that like, I'm willing to tolerate the bugs. Or maybe they wait until all the bugs are gone and they ship it and it's perfect and the customer's happy in that instance. Either way, let's say they pick the decision of they're going to ship it with the bugs but get it out on time. There's a consequence to that decision based on the customer's reaction. Yeah, video games are, that Sony game where they shipped it way too early, right? There's going to be a customer reaction to that decision, and there will be consequences. And either it will work well enough, it doesn't need to work perfectly, but the decision will work well enough, or it won't. Let's say they ship it and it has some bugs, but everybody's still happy. The next time that they encounter that decision, it's not going to be figuring it out from scratch. They're going to have a little bit more context, a little bit more like, oh, well, last time we saw this problem, we shipped it with some bugs, but we shipped it on time. We hit our release date, and that's the important thing. And we fixed the bugs afterwards, and the customer was fine with that. So like, it seemed to work well enough last time. That's how we're going to do it this time. And they will keep facing that decision as that company grows and becomes more and more successful. And eventually, it's going to come to a point in that organization's development where they encounter this problem, and people don't stop to say, oh, what decision should we make? They're going to be like, oh, we just ship it because that's the way we do things here. And that's the point at which an organization's culture is formed. It's seeing those decisions and that decision being made the first few times, and it's being made in a certain way, and eventually it happens so often and it works well enough. Again, it doesn't need to work perfectly. It just needs to work well enough that eventually when you see a problem or you see a decision, then that's just the way we do things here is formed. And like, that's a really, really important insight, because so much of what your working life is going to be when you step into an organization is you adapting and understanding to the culture of the organization, and it having this kind of like, okay, this is the way we make decisions here. And there are all kinds of ways that companies do this, like whether it's how it treats employees, how it treats customers, how it thinks about things like privacy and security and the importance it puts on those things. Like all these things are like, once an organization has grown up, it starts to have a culture around. And a big part of whether you're going to enjoy and fit into working at an organization is understanding the types of decisions like that it makes, and making sure that they're aligned with your own set of values. There are all kinds of interesting ways that you can use this understanding. I'm sure some of you are going to go and decide to found startups. And if you're a founder, thinking through some of these decisions before you actually meet those decisions in the real world is really important. Like having some thought about, okay, what kind of company do I want to have? Like, what's important to me? Like, when faced with the ship early with bugs or ship later above a certain bar and miss the date, like all kinds of decisions like that, it's worth sitting down and thinking through before you actually meet them. Because again, the test is, does it work well enough? And maybe you won't be involved in that initial decision around whether to ship or not, or maybe it'll be some other decision. But again, the test that the culture has is always, does this work well enough? And maybe the customer doesn't complain when you ship it early but filled with bugs, but that's not the kind of company that you want to found. You want to found a company where it's like, okay, we're on a certain bar and it's okay to miss the date, but like we don't ship buggy software. Like maybe that's the kind of company that you want. And so again, maybe the customer doesn't complain, but you as a founder or you as a manager can pull those people up and say, hey, look, we face this decision. You made it such that we shipped even though there's bugs. Like that's not the way we do things here. The way we do things here is we make sure it passes a certain bar, or we get all the bugs out before we ship, even if it means we miss the release dates. And then that decision didn't work well enough for those people involved, because the founder or the manager or whoever it might be, whoever you are, sits them down and says, this isn't good enough. And so the next time they encounter that decision, they're going to make a different decision. And that becomes the path on which your culture is set. It's incredibly powerful for a founder of a company, because especially as a company grows, you're not going to be able to sit in every one of those meetings, like with thousands or tens of thousands of employees. But the culture is almost like an invisible hand guiding employees to make decisions in certain ways. And you see big successful tech firms that look very different from each other. And obviously, there are many reasons for it, but like culture is one of those things that just keeps on guiding things in certain directions. Like you think about the difference between a company like Amazon and another company like Apple, where Amazon is like, we ship early. It doesn't matter if it's got some bugs in it, doesn't need to be perfect, but it's just this relentless improvement. We get it out there and we keep going. Whereas Apple is like lots of secrecy. We do very few things, but the things we do must be absolutely great. And if it's not at the bar of absolutely great, we're not going to release it to the world. And that's just in terms of the way they make product decisions. There are all kinds of other decisions that get made, but like culture is one of the things that determines like how those people in all those organizations make those decisions and are aligned, even though it's like so many people working in each. And like part of your job as you think about companies that you'd like to work for is, well, yeah, it's partly what you're going to be doing, and it's partly all those things that we talked about in the motivation aspect of things, where it's like hygiene factors versus motivators. But it's also to understand the culture and to think about, okay, which of these organizations, the culture and how it's formed and the decisions they make, which of these places are going to be places where I'm going to be excited to work. All right, as promised, I've spoken for a bunch, spoken for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, a while anyway. I promised to make this interactive. And I think that's where I'd like to take this. So like, let's open it up. Again, yeah, feel like anything is fair game. There are maybe a couple of things that that may be off limits, but assume there are none. And if there are, then I'll say, hey, sorry, I can't answer that. But whether it's Exponent or the book or an MBA or what it's like working in Singapore at the moment, or anything that we just talked about, like, feel free. I'd love to have a conversation with you folks.
Yeah, so why don't we kind of do this? I guess a little bit like normal, but if no one's speaking, feel free to unmute and just go for it. But if you'd like to raise your hand, then I can also call on folks. And if you can't use or if you're not in a space to use your mic, feel free to drop a question in the chat, and I will also read that out. Everyone's a little quiet today.
Here.
Yeah. So I guess first question. So what is it like? Got a couple in the chat now. Cool. So yeah, thoughts on the viability of general super intelligence, and on accelerationist aesthetics in general.
Accelerationist aesthetics. I'm not familiar with that term. Is
I'm
this
not either, actually. Yeah, Michael, do you have a little bit of context, or
I'm Googling it.
Yeah. Interesting.
This doesn't seem to be an easy one to just like Google.
Yeah.
Oh. Is this accelerationism, the idea that capitalism and technological change can or should be accelerated and drastically exaggerated? The goal of acceleration is to trigger unprecedented revolt in the establishment of a new, unique political and economic system. Michael, is that what you mean? Like, you don't feel like capitalism and technology is on a sustainable path? And
let's see. There's also he also has the sort of first part of this question. If you have thoughts on the viability of sort of super intelligence as.
I mean, okay, interesting. I mean, there are many people thinking about this kind of thing. I think we have, by super intelligence, I think like general purpose AI, like a self-aware type AI. And I mean, I think interesting. It's not clear to me how close we are to actually achieving that. Like, there's lots of narrow AI, and it's like machine learning in very specific domains that's become incredibly important to business and has an incredible amount of power. Not clear to me how close or how far away we're getting from like getting to a general purpose AI and what that's going to look like. I think a lot of people think it's close. I'm not entirely convinced it is, but there are also probably people that are much smarter than me who are working on this kind of stuff and probably would be better placed to answer that question. So I'm going to let that one go. If you want to come back around like whether you think capitalism is working or not, like if that's the point of the question, then throw it back in the chat and I'll come back to you. I'd love a little bit more context. I'm going to go down through the list.
Yeah.
Ritu, what's it like working in Singapore? So I left San Francisco on Christmas Day last year. I was aiming to be on a flight with the minimum number of other people on it, and I managed to achieve that. I was on so I'm originally from Australia, and I went back there first to do a 2-week quarantine because that's what a lot of these countries who have COVID completely under control before wide use of vaccines, that's basically the regimen they're on. It was crazy being on that flight because there were more crew than there were passengers. it felt like I almost had a private Boeing 787 from San Francisco to Sydney. 2 weeks of quarantine really sucked. I would not recommend being locked up in a hotel room for 2 weeks. Even a hotel room, like the insight around just taking away someone's freedom is punishment enough, as opposed to needing to make a prison inhumane. You can have a very humane prison, but taking away freedom is certainly not much fun. The weird thing was being on the other side and going from a place that was very COVID was kind of like, even San Francisco, the Bay Area, was doing relatively well, and I think of all the big American cities, probably did the best in terms of like managing it. To a place where COVID was still there, it was still a threat, to like a place where there was no COVID whatsoever. And it took me a while to adapt. Like it, in the spirit of in the spirit of the whole parable I told at the start, I was very conditioned to there being danger all around, and suddenly the danger had gone, but my brain wasn't that quick to just let it go. And I think that was probably a defense mechanism. Like I was insisting on wearing a mask everywhere, but the city in Australia, Canberra, where I was at, there's no mask mandate. They've had like 2 cases of COVID in the entire of 2020, and people were, I mean, they weren't looking at me funny. They knew why I was wearing a mask, but it was definitely me being the outlier. Someone would get too close to me in the gym and I would be like, why are you standing so close? But give it a week and I'd pretty much adapted. Singapore has been great. COVID's very much under control. There is obviously a little bit of a cultural difference between being in a place like Singapore and being in the US, but I've also worked in Thailand, and it's certainly not as extreme a cultural difference as that. Actually, Singapore is interesting because it really does kind of feel like this halfway point between the cultures of the East and the West. From an ethnicity perspective, it's 70% Chinese, but the Commonwealth history and the fact that it's based on a Commonwealth style of government, and there are lots of folks who from different places. It's kind of like this melting pot, and I, for one, really enjoy working here. Of course, there's like some cultural considerations that like it's important to be aware of. Like people aren't quite as outspoken or go-getter as they might be in the West. Like people are more reserved, and it's important to make accommodations for people like that, and to be a little bit more, yeah, I have to adapt some of my mannerisms, but like I feel like that's one of the joys of working in a place like this. And if you ever get the chance to work overseas, I would encourage everybody to do it, because you don't quite realize how many of the cultural adaptations you've accepted as just normal in one country. You realize like that's very much a function of the country I'm in, until you go to another country and realize things work entirely differently. On a more day-to-day level, like the food is great, the people are super friendly. There are swimming pools everywhere. I used to be a swimmer, so I love all the swimming pools everywhere. It is very hot and very humid too, which I think I probably prefer the Bay Area temperature. And I'm probably better suited to the Bay Area temperature, but I'm slowly getting used to it. But it's been really good. The next question, wanted to enter the business end. Would I need to go for an MBA, or would there generally be opportunities to get involved? Also, generally, I guess, what was getting an MBA like? Good question. You absolutely do not need to get an MBA to get involved in the world of business. Absolutely not. Like, business is very simple. Business from its simplest level is like, you need to create, business is the art of creating a customer. Like, someone has a problem somewhere and you are solving that problem, whether it's a personal problem or like around like, wanting to make people feel good about themselves and are like all the luxury goods, through to like they have a more like grounded business problem, like they want their website to be faster or more secure or more reliable, and they come to a place like Cloudflare. But at a very simple level, you want to find a way of creating a customer. And then the next test is, you kind of want to find a way of creating a customer profitably. And that means if they pay you more than it costs you to create the product or service, that they end up buying from you. There are lots and lots and lots of technical things about business, but if you're a computer science person, you have a very valuable skill, which is you can speak computer and you can make computers do whatever it is that you want them to do. Generally speaking, you should be able to find someone who is skilled in the world of business and understanding how to build a business model and what's a good strategy, what's a good go-to-market, all these fancy terms that business people tend to use. Like, you should be able to find someone to partner up with and figure out, like, okay, these are the ways in which we're going to take this product that maybe you've built or you're helping building, take it to market and make it a profitable business. There are other things you can do to understand the world of business. Part of the reason, Ben and I started the Exponent podcast is we missed the conversations from business school and we wanted to kind of recreate them. And it just so happens that you can go find things like that and listen to them, and you will gradually absorb a lot of the stuff of business without necessarily having to go to the extent of getting an MBA. That being said, I loved business school. It was 2 years. There aren't many, so you guys are all in school right now, and what you'll realize when you leave is how great you actually had it. You don't really realize that until you leave. And there are nice things about leaving, like you get paid and et cetera, et cetera. But there are things about the freedom and ability to indulge intellectual curiosity inside of an academic environment that's hard to get elsewhere. An MBA is one of the few things where you effectively can take 2 years off partway through your career. And it's almost like, I viewed it almost like a holiday because I loved it so much, but it doesn't look like a 2-year break in your career. And you learn a whole bunch of stuff and you get to pick classes that you're interested in and make amazing friends and go traveling and do all these kinds of things. I also learned a bunch of things in my MBA that I never thought I'd really need, like how to listen to people and like how to listen in a conversation. I always used to listen with a view to responding as opposed to listen with a view to understanding. Those are different things, and the MBA classroom teaches you that. Generally speaking, here's how I would boil it down. If you know for sure after 3 or 4 years of work experience what you want to do with your career, it's probably best to just go do it. If you're not sure, or you have curiosity about other things, or you're looking for a way of taking a break, an MBA at a good school, I would definitely recommend a top tier school. But given the audience that I'm speaking to right now, I would be very surprised if you couldn't get into a top tier school. An MBA at a top tier school is a good option. Let's keep going down. How do you plan your tech career's progress based on where you are to where you want to go? Do you think about what you want in general? This is what I want to accomplish. This is a really good question. There's another one of the theories that is really helpful in answering this question, which is one by Rita McGrath on the strategy making process. And so the strategy process, McGrath defines it in terms of two things. There's emergent strategy and deliberate strategy. Emergent strategy, and it's a spectrum. Emergent strategy is, I'm not sure what I want to do or how to, I'm not sure about the answer. And so I'm going to be very open to opportunity. And this is kind of the approach that I took. I had general interest areas. I had an interest area in tech. I had an interest area in business, kind of figured out I would end up at the intersection of these two places. But beyond that, I was pretty emergent. Now, I heard the consulting companies come to my undergrad and say, oh, you don't need to pick what you get to do. You get to travel all around the world. And by the way, after 3 years, we'll pay for you to do an MBA anywhere in the world. And I was like, I did my undergrad in my hometown. By the end of it, I kind of regretted not going away. I really loved the idea of getting across to the US because I knew there was much more tech over there. So that sounds like a good option. And I followed that path, got into business school, thought I wanted to work at Apple because I loved Apple, got a summer internship there, realized this is not exactly what I thought it would be. It's an amazing company, but I'm going to have to work here for 20 years before anyone's going to give me any real authority to make big decisions. That's not exactly what I wanted to do. And then Clay came along and he was like, you want to work with me? And I was like, this is not part of the plan. Writing a book with a business school professor, I never would have imagined being able to do that before. That was one of the things that I wanted to do before business school. And if I'd been fixated on the goal, then I'd have said, no, Clay, I'm here to work at a tech company. I'm going to keep going. But it was like, I'm not sure I have the answer here. And this sounds like a really cool opportunity. And I'm in this emergent type phase where I'm still trying to figure it out. So I'm going to say yes. And I'm so glad I did, because I learned so much and had so much fun. But that wrapped up, and I didn't want to become a writer for the rest of my life, though I love writing. I feel like it's something I do in addition to. And I almost went down the academic path, but like there's something about doing a PhD in the business world where it's a little bit softer that made me feel uncomfortable. So I was like, okay, going back to the tech path, and I went from B to C to B to B, which I was like, and then I discovered I actually kind of liked it. And then there were things about one of the companies I worked at I didn't like, and then I corrected a little bit more and corrected it a little bit more. And I've gone from an emergent, very aperture, very open, not sure what the answer is, to like more deliberate, where it's like, oh, this is a strategy that works for me, which is I kind of have a portfolio of things. I have this day job with Cloudflare where I really enjoy what I do. I have this podcast that kind of indulges this kind of intellectual curiosity and almost like this teaching side of things that I really enjoy. Like I still write a bit, like, and I've kind of narrowed in on this, and this is working. And now it's working. Like the point about McGrath's deliberate strategy is you have an approach that works. You need to close the aperture, because if you leave the aperture open, you just end up staying in this unfocused state. But once you figure out something that works, like start to focus in on it and go deeper. And I'd say that's my general approach to a tech career. There are some careers where it's like, Clay also described this to me. There are two types of careers. There's climbing a ladder, and there's something that looks more like pinball. And climbing a ladder, if you end up in investment banking or management consulting, it feels great. You just do what they tell you to do and you climb the ladder. But the certainty comes with trade-offs. Like you get very few deviations. People fall off the ladder at every rung because they're not good enough or the firm manages them out. Pinball can be very uncomfortable at times, and you have to take responsibility for your career, but it opens up all kinds of interesting things as a result. And if you forced me to choose between ladders and pinball, I'd take pinball every time. The trick with pinball is you've got to stay open to unexpected opportunities, try things, figure out what you like about each thing and what you don't like, and then iterate. And like the next one, okay, like this, didn't like that. The next job needs to have more of the things I like and less of the things I don't like. And you get closer to what you want to do. I hope that answers the question, Xavier. Mason, was it difficult to fend off the pressure of pursuing a career like PE or banking while at HBS? How did you remain confident that your path was the one you wanted to take? Good question. It's especially difficult because in places, there's a culture inside of HBS of like, you want to have a job, you want to appear like everything's figured out, and like these are the well-paying jobs, these are the good-paying jobs, these are the things people want to do. Those companies turn up at campus super early and start recruiting, and then like you're the one that's like not got an internship yet. Like, what are you doing? Like everyone else has got internships, and like everybody else seems to have their life figured out. And like, why aren't you going? There is pressure to do that. I think this is part of the, like, I knew why I wanted to go to business school. It was, I'd been in that life. Like I'd been in the big firm life, and it was not what I wanted. It was not what I enjoyed. There were things I really appreciate about it, but like I went to business school because I wanted to switch. And so I held out, and I ended up convincing Apple to give me an internship, and I had a great time there, and it was a great experience. And then the same thing with Clay. It was like, everybody's going off to join McKinsey. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, everyone would say, oh, that's cool. Like you're working with Clay, but like, then they would go off and work with McKinsey. And yeah, it did. That definitely felt like there was pressure, but it's just a case of knowing yourself and realizing you're running your race, or swimming, for me, swimming your race. Like there's this feeling like you've got to rush, and you've got to do everything on a specific timeline, and you're in competition with all your peers. But like the thing about it is like like judging yourself on the people around you is like a really big mistake. And like, let me put it to you like this. Like, do you keep track of the folks you're in kindergarten or first grade with and say, oh, am I in front of them or not? And I know it feels like the people in class with you at Berkeley right now are the ones that you're comparing yourself to. And for me, it was HBS MBA. But really, like, comparing yourself and like running someone else's race is just going to lead you down the wrong track. Like, figuring out I'm running my own race and like things are going to happen for me on my own time. And also, I like different things to all these other people. And maybe I'm going to have to swing a few times before I hit. Like, realizing that it's not a competition with your peers will be so freeing. And that will also happen in your first few jobs. You will compare yourself, like someone's getting promoted faster or slower. It doesn't matter. Like, you got to stay true to yourself. Am I learning? Am I shouldering responsibility? Does this matter to me? Like the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. As long as you're putting in, as long as you're working hard, you're giving it a fair shot, you enjoy what you're doing, I think that's much more important than the hygiene factors of like, oh, is someone getting paid more or is being promoted faster or whatever. And if it's a friend, like, and they are, like, feel good for them. But that's the only feeling that I encourage you to have towards what's happening to other people. Just focus on what you're doing and what matters to you.
I think Billy has had his hand up for
Okay,
a few minutes.
Billy.
So yeah, why don't we? And then I have the position saved too if we need to go back to that.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay,
yeah.
awesome. Hey, Billy.
Hi, sorry about raising my hand. I just felt like it would be easier to say.
No, it's good.
Yeah, so we read the article by Christensen before this class today, and he talked about, I was going to ask you, like, oh, how did you figure out your own yardstick? But I realized part of what he wrote about was kind of the value in, or I was going to ask how any advice you would have to choose your own yardstick and choose the kind of tools used to evaluate where you're going. But Christensen wrote a little bit about, you know, the value in just hearing about other experiences so you understand the model so you can then apply it to yourself. So I'm curious how you've gone about figuring out your own yardstick and how that has changed kind of like, I know you've touched on it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that in terms of how we can use that to kind of figure out where we might want to go.
Yeah, it's interesting. So thanks for the question. Clay was a remarkable human being, and like, we have very different fundamental ways of thinking about the world. He was a devout Mormon and I'm an atheist, and like his religion comes across in a lot of his writing. And actually, it made me a little bit nervous about working with him. But in retrospect, I'm so glad I did, because I think it's one of these things where getting exposed to people that are fundamentally different to you and having to compromise with them, it's not actually a bad thing. It's a really good thing. It gives you empathy. It gives you exposure to just another point of view on the world. I have increasingly found myself in a place that is very similar to where Clay is. Like, I think his idea of the number of people whose lives you've positively touched is like a really, really, really good way of like thinking about the world and thinking about how to frame a career or what really matters. Like, I know for a fact, I used to think money was really important. I can tell you right now, like, getting a message from somebody like, you've changed the trajectory of my life, like, that feels infinitely better than any amount of money. At least it does to me. And that's the kind of experience that you need to have in order to kind of figure out what your yardstick might be. I will say one other thing that's increasingly risen in prominence for me, which has been the contribution I make to the ways in which the world operates, or the way, and this is I'm still figuring this one out, but it's like the realization that liberal democracy is, while an imperfect system of government, is like one that I really value, and liberalism and freedom of speech. And yeah, it comes with consequences, but the alternative is not something that I really want to live in. And authoritarianism over the past 12 to 24 months in particular has had a good run, because there are some circumstances under which an authoritarian system actually works pretty well. And dealing with a pandemic and just saying to your population, you're not going anywhere, you're staying locked up. And if you say anything critical of us, we're going to lock you up. That works really well in a pandemic. But I don't think we should judge the quality of a system under such conditions alone. And like being able to criticize a government, being able to speak my mind, I think those are really important for a variety of reasons. Like having people be able to live the types of lives that they want to live, as long as they're not hurting other people, I think is really important. But also in terms of like, I mean, part of my job is innovation, and coming up with like big ideas are often dangerous ideas when they first emerge, and they threaten authorities. And you see this all the way back from like how churches responded, for example, to the evolution, like whether it's theory of evolution or the evolution of physics, and the sun being at the center of the universe versus the earth being at the center of the universe, center of the galaxy, excuse me, sun being at the center versus the earth. Like these ideas were always dangerous. And if you allow an authority to push down ideas that it deems dangerous or that criticize it, like, yeah, sure, you're going to squash a whole bunch of misinformation, which might not be a bad thing. But the cost of that are the truly innovative ideas that people can be called pariahs for. Like, it's really interesting to read the history of the lady who developed like did a whole bunch of the research on mRNA, which is the basis of like a bunch of the very effective vaccines we have right now. She was like, people were laughing at her. She had a really tough time getting funding. And it turns out this is the basis for like some of the most effective vaccines we now have. And so this is a roundabout way of being like increasingly, in addition to this, like the number of lives that I've touched and individuals, not en masse, but like one of the things that's increasingly becoming important to me is like system of governance and the water in which we swim, so to speak. I think there's going to be a bit of a competition between these systems, and I deeply believe in one, and I have been the beneficiary of it. And I, again, seeing the contrast between R1 and the one that's emerging, really deeply have an appreciation for the fact that I can call Donald Trump a friggin' moron. I would have to be a little bit more reserved operating in the other system. I think I kind of want to make sure that like we preserve that. That's important to me. Yeah. But it's a very personal thing, and it's like one that's being driven by experience. And you in the book, he talks about kind of sketching it out in pencil and trying it on before kind of coloring it in with ink or pen. And I think that's that's the way to do it. It's like a deeply personal thing, and you're aware of it, and you try various things, and you see what resonates with you. And that, as you, again, you go from like being quite open to like, okay, this is the thing that matters, and this is where I'm going to double down. Thanks for the question.
Cool. I think let's see where next would be a Yu Hang's question. When making decisions, what steps did you take to avoid biases, FOMO, emotions, etc.?
You know, it's a really good question. And so like one of the first things to be aware, like the first steps to take in fixing this is to be aware of it. And for anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to read Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, highly recommend it, where he starts to lay out some of these, lay out some of these, his research and other research on the biases that we have. And like being aware of it is like the first of it. Beyond that, I like to think that I'm a highly rational decision maker, but like, like I'm probably just as subject to it as everybody else, and I do so too. I will say this idea that emotions are a bad thing that should always be driven out of decision making, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with. One of the things that's like really interesting to me is evolutionary biology, and like the basis of evolutionary biology is things that are functional, that help you survive and help you make decisions in a certain environment, are useful things, and they're things that end up progressing for the like through generations. Like it's an adaptive response. Now obviously you want to understand where adaptations that used to make sense no longer make sense. So for example, I feel really good when I stuff my face filled with like I go get a bunch of deep fried chips, like go to McDonald's and get fries, and like they taste really good. And like there's an evolutionary biology explanation for that, which is calories used to be scarce and you didn't always know when you'd get your next meal. So getting something that's extremely calorific and putting it in your mouth feels good, because that's your body's way of saying, oh, you're going to survive for longer. Now, we now exist in a world in which we've gone from, for most of us anyway, or the ones on this call, we've gone from a world of calorific deficit to a world of extreme calorific surplus. And so this is where your body is lying to you. But like there are plenty of instances where that may not actually still be the case. And emotions are a way of taking what are otherwise very complex situations and helping you make sense of them. And so a trap that people fall into is, I want to be a rational decision maker and therefore I'm going to ignore emotions. That's not like, in my experience at least, emotions are almost like little children. If you ignore them, they only get stronger. And so being aware that they're there and actually listening to them and trying to figure out what's going on, I think is a really important aspect of this. And so not just discounting emotions, but trying to understand what's going on and what's causing you to feel this way, I think is a really important part of that. And I think you'll find it's important in your personal lives, obviously, but you'll find it's also important in work. Like this idea that we just check out our personalities and I check out all our emotions and all these non-rational things when we get to the door, I think is a mistake. And like when we're like, understanding and being comfortable dealing in like an emotionality and at work is like really important, and being able to have difficult conversations with people where they're feeling things that maybe don't seem rational or they're uncomfortable about, but being able to delve into that and being able to do it for yourself is really important. Have I mastered this? No, but I feel like it's just an ongoing thing. So being aware of it, not being being aware of the biases, I think is like a great first step, so you can help to mitigate that. But being comfortable with emotions, and like, I don't know, I'm not too ashamed to say that I've been in therapy for a number of years and I found it extremely helpful, again, not just in a personal, but also in a work context. You can kind of see the people at work who haven't done the work to master themselves in this way. So like doing the best you can to like dive into difficult things, difficult feelings, not running away from them, I think is really important. I think that's all I've got. I won't claim to be this master. I'm not Buddha. I'm not sitting up on the hill with all the answers and like I've mastered everything, making perfect decisions, but that's where I'm at and that's how I think about it. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Yeah. We've got a few more questions. So next one from Anish. How do you find the balance between the two factors
hygiene,
in a motivator? Yeah.
I feel like, again, it's a personal thing. I think the starting point is to understand that these two things work. And I love this engineering question. You understand the two factors and now you're already trying to optimize for the perfect balance between the two. The way to optimize is going to be a deeply personal set of experiences. It's the first step is to understand these two things work concurrently, and they are two separate things and you need to figure them out separately. And then it becomes a deeply personal thing. Like what that amount of money is for you to live comfortably is actually a function of where you're living. Like $100,000, $50,000 in New York is not going to get you very far. $50,000 living in a developing country could get you a very long way. So it's like there's no one perfect answer on any of these things. It's important to do the work though, to like understand what matters, understand like what are the things I want to learn, where am I going to get responsibility. And it's like the yardstick thing. You're going to try it and apply it and you're going to see, but like you now have a framework in which to take inputs from the real world and gradually refine your model. Oh, like this amount of money doesn't really do anything much for me, like anymore for me, but like, oh, I tried this job and like, I really love this aspect, or I really deeply believe in this aspect of this thing. So I'm gonna go for it. So it's understand the model, and there's no perfect balance, but again, the general approach is satisfy one and optimize for the other, and then have the model and put inputs in through real world experience and refine your own version of the model. So Brian has direct messaged me in order after Anish, and I'm going to read his question. If I'm majoring in EECS and planning to take an MBA in the future, or that's what he's planning on doing, since we need job experience to be admitted in MBA programs, would you recommend to take business-related work experience after graduation or more towards programming-related work? Here's what I would say. Go do the thing that is most interesting to you, that you want to learn. Do not optimize for an MBA admissions process. Like, I don't think that's a good way of living life. Go figure out what it is that's most interesting to you. So the MBA admissions process, if you're really being honest to it, they're going to ask you questions like, what matters most to you and why? Like, why do you want to do an MBA? Why should we take you? And you're going to have to write an essay. And the art to writing that essay is writing an essay that's so specific that it can only apply to you. It should explain why you did what you did, why you're now at business school, and what you want to do with it afterwards. And you're going to have a whole bunch of data points, and you need to draw a line through all those data points and tell a story about why you've done these things. And the best way to do it is to have gone and done something meaningful and difficult and learnt a bunch, as opposed to, like, not to disparage people who went to consulting, because I went to consulting. I went to a consulting firm, because then you just sound like everybody else who's applying for an MBA, and I did that too. But like, go do something that you're interested in, that you think you're really going to enjoy, that you think is going to put a ding in the world. And maybe you fail dismally, but it's going to be amazing frigging experience. And maybe you succeed and you're going to learn something fantastic as well. But like, focus on, like, you've got a short amount of time. Focus on like what you can learn and what you can gain from that work experience, and like what the contribution is you can make. And like, trust in the process that if you go pick on that basis, you'll get a pretty good MBA application. Keen is asking me, my background is in CS, but you took an MBA. Would I recommend? You probably already know my answer. So I did undergrad in part comp sci, part business. So I did 2 degrees undergrad, and it became very clear to me that my mind was better suited to understanding people than understanding algorithms. And so I went down the business route and then just doubled down on the MBA. I would say, if you want to get into management, or you've tried coding and you don't like it, and you want to get exposure to product management, but you can't get directly in, though you probably could, or if you're curious, like we talked a little bit about reasons to do an MBA, then I would recommend an MBA at that point. But if you're sure you want to, like, there's no one right path. And like, if you're curious about programming or like being an engineer, go be an engineer. And if you really like it, then it kind of limits the need to do an MBA. I'm going to keep working down the list. For anyone celebrating Ramadan, we will not mark you off for leaving this call. Yes, absolutely not. I hope everyone who's celebrating Ramadan is doing well. Hi, Jen. Thoughts on how we can prevent companies, especially tech companies, from taking the place of autocratic governments in democratic nations with tools like mass surveillance, behavioral scores? Oh, this is a good one. By bringing awareness to how, I mean, this is one of these things where, again, like one of the roles of, like, the assumption of a properly functioning democratic society is that people are engaged and they care. Like, you know, it's easy to walk into your house and say, oh, I care about my house, I'm going to keep my house clean, this is my house. But like, there can sometimes be a tragedy of the commons where, you know, oh, this is somebody else's problem to fix these things. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, it's all our responsibility to live here and to like optimize, like to make this country or society a great society to live in and to be civically engaged. And so, especially for the folks on this call who are well educated and have an understanding of how these organizations work and the impact, like, it's important to make your voice heard and say, okay, I don't like the way this company is operating and I need to do something about it. And to share that, and not to lecture other people, but to help them understand it as well. It's part of the reason why I do the Exponent podcast. Like, back in 2014, I was calling Facebook out for like some of their behaviors, like the early versions of their API, in order to try and get developers on board. They would literally give away people's private information, not just the people who signed up for a game, but all the private information of people that those people were connected to. So they would get second order information. And there are probably infinite numbers of my profile, like at least an old version, floating around because Facebook was like, we're willing to give this away. Who cares about privacy if it gets more developers on board, because this is important to our strategy. And like a few things, that's reprehensible. It's in their culture probably, and then maybe slowly changing it, but they're still feeling the reputational effects of doing that. But like, another aspect to consider, do you want to work at a place like that? I personally couldn't. Maybe it's not important to you and I wouldn't hold it against you if you decided to, but it's like, be sure, like, think about the culture and how that aligns with your values. And then more broadly, if that's not the kind of society you want to live in, then you got to speak up, because you've got to vote, you've got a voice, you have resources at your disposal. Use them to make this place, your country, where you're living, the kind of country, the kind of society you want to live in. Because the point at which apathy kicks in, or it's like, this is not, we're all losing. What gives me hope is like reading stuff to see that young folks like you guys are more civically engaged than any other generation of Americans. And I realize I'm not American, and not everyone on this call will be American, but there are increasing amounts of civic engagement. And it's like, shape the world that you want to see. And that's going to be the best defense against some of these tech companies doing shady stuff. I think it's really important. How are we doing for time, Michael?
It's about 8:30, so yeah, I've got time to hang around.
I do too. We're almost at the end of all these questions.
I think there's one more main question in the chat if I am reading through. So we've got that, and then I've got one sort of at the end relating actually to kind of the previous question. Right. But and then I guess if there's any final questions after that, if others have thoughts, drop them in the chat or raise your hand and we can take a couple last questions. But yeah, let's.
Awesome. So burnout. It's a really good question. This worked for me, and it's a hard strategy to implement. But like, I remember I finished grad school. Well, actually, Clay tells this story about how, like, when he did a stint in management consulting, and a partner came to him and said, we need you to work on Saturday. And he's like, I'm sorry, I've made this commitment to my family. I spent Saturday with them. And the partner was incredulous. It's like, what do you mean? This is Boston Consulting Group. We work weekends all the time. Like, you want to work here? And he's like, look, I'm really sorry. If you want me to work here, I need to keep this commitment to my family. I don't work on Saturdays. And the partner walked off in a huff. It's like, can't believe this. It's like, and he comes back a couple of hours later and he's like, well, okay, fine. I understand you can't do Saturday. We've moved the meeting to Sunday instead. And Clay is like, oh boy. I'm really sorry. I made a commitment to God that I wouldn't work on Sunday. Sunday is my day for spending dedicated to my faith. And the partner is like, what the hell? Like, you know, like this is BCG. Like, you people work here on the weekends. And again, Clay's like, look, I'm really sorry. I really want to work here, but I've made these commitments and they're important to me. And if you're going to ask me to break them, then maybe I can't work here. Partner stormed off in a huff. And then he came back and he's like, we moved the meeting to Monday. Do you happen to work on Monday? And there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek there at the end. But I think one of the things that's really important with burnout is to start to draw boundaries for yourself. And it's hard, especially when you're starting out, and you may struggle a little bit at the start. But like, I got to a point after my MBA where I decided like I was going to draw boundaries for myself. And one of the things was like, I want to exercise every day. And so I would say like at 5, swimming would start at 6. At 5:30, I would say, sorry guys, I'm happy to come back online later on tonight. But like right now I'm going off to the pool and I'm not going to be too ashamed about it. And if there's more work to be done, I'll come back. And after a while, people just accepted it. They realized like in the same that like they would just know that 5:30 James was out of the office, and if there was more work he would come back. It wasn't because he was lazy, it was just because this was an important thing for him. And it is for me. Like exercise is one of the ways in which I avoid burnout. You will have certain things and it's important for you to try and figure out those boundaries. For me now, I don't think I would work at a place, for example, that required me to travel lots on an ongoing basis, because like whether it's a routine of like exercise and seeing friends and doing things like that is really important to me. And consulting was great, but I was always on the road. I could never join a swimming squad. I couldn't go do yoga or something like that at a reliable place. I couldn't see my friends. The only friends I had at the end of consulting were people in the consulting firm, because they were the only people I would see. And it's like, that's not the kind of life I wanted to lead. So like putting boundaries in place and figuring out what matters and structuring life around that, I think is the best defense you have. I will not lie. I realize it is especially hard to do this at the start of your career, and especially in some professions. And I think ultimately then you face a decision, which is like, okay, am I willing to bend on this at the start of my career because I know I'm going to need to work hard somewhere? Or is what they're asking me to do too much? And in the same way that Clay was like, look, if you need me to do this on a Saturday or a Sunday, I can't work here. Maybe you need to make your own decision there. But I think the boundaries are a good thing. Understanding what works and what doesn't in terms of keeping you sane. For me, it's exercise. For you, it might be something else. I think that's a good thing. Trying to get a decent amount of sleep is also a good thing. And then also remembering like, there is also more to life than work too. And remembering to like go take time off. And sure, 90% of your life is going to be the routinized go take, you know, you go to like the office, you do work, and like those things end up like that sums up to like what ends up being what your life looks like is the routine. But there's also 10 or 20% of your time where you have a lot more discretion, and like go do crazy, enjoyable, whatever it might be things. Like the things that obviously like being fit and healthy is a function of making good decisions on a regular basis. But like I think back in time, and like you're in the Bay Area, like I went to Burning Man 4 times, and like that's a week off in the desert, and like that was an amazing experience. Like those are the things like when you're sitting down and whether you're talking with friends or just reminiscing about like amazing experiences in life, make sure you leave space for those type of experiences too, because they're really important. That's part of the reason why we work, to go experience things like that. How are we doing, Michael?
Cool. Yeah, I think we've got one more question, and then I have my question, which actually I think I will ask, and this might actually lead into the other one.
Okay.
So earlier this semester, like when we've talked about various aspects of free speech, and this one may get a little bit into that gray area, but as much as you know, you can share is I think goes with the theme of sort of making tough decisions. So we talked about Matthew's decision to kick the Daily Stormer off Cloudflare. And I don't think we talked about it too much, but sort of more recently, there was the decision around 8chan. And I kind of wonder sort of if you could share what it's like being in some of the rooms around that discussion, and how sort of your own principles um, and the effect that those things can actually have in the world affect sort of the decision making and how you approach dealing with those challenges.
Yeah, so I wasn't at Cloudflare when the Daily Stormer
Mhm.
decision happened. In fact, that's part of the reason I ended up working here, because Ben and I ended up podcasting about the Daily Stormer, and then Matthew heard it and reached out and said, "You should work here." Um, I think part of it is, like, again, one of these things around principles and where your principles lie, and like principles in general, like, only matter when they're inconvenient. Like, it's easy to stick to your principles when it's easy. It's much harder when it's difficult or there's going to be blowback. And like, there are some customers that I'll be honest, we have, that I find incredibly, incredibly distasteful. Like, I identify as a member of the LGBT community. There are some people saying some goddamn awful stuff about gays and people who are trans, and like, but the broader principle is, like, are we going to be the ones, especially at our position in the stack, which is not, it's fundamental infrastructure. Like, we're not like a Facebook or a Twitter where we're deciding what to algorithmically accelerate and put in front of lots of people. Like, we are the digital equivalent of selling paper or electricity. Like, if you don't have a service like Cloudflare sitting in front of you, someone doesn't like what you say, they simply DDoS you and you completely knocked off the internet. And so us making a decision at this point in the stack around who should be online and who should be offline is actually, I don't think a company, just like a whole bunch of generally white people sitting in San Francisco, not just white people, white men sitting in San Francisco, should be making those decisions. Because yeah, there are a bunch of extremely distasteful things, but amongst some of those distasteful things, like, it's easy to forget that 50 years ago, like, the idea of gay marriage, that was an extremely distasteful thing as well. And if you have someone acting as a gatekeeper, deciding what's okay and what's not, yeah, sure, they're probably going to take out a lot of stuff that's not great, but they're also going to take out some ideas that are really important and that really are great, but at the time seem like they shouldn't be great and seem dangerous and seem like that they shouldn't exist. And so part of the reason why I like working here is because that principle exists. And in general, it is an extremely principled place. And like, that's super important to me, as opposed to, because we've made the hard work, we've done the hard work around how to make the decisions before the hard decisions need to be made. Now, there are exceptions, and you brought them up. The Daily Stormer, I think Matthew's intention with this was, people are just criticizing us here. Like, nobody realizes there's actually a principle. Like, you really want me to just decide what goes on the internet and what doesn't? Okay, I'm going to do this for you. Let's see how everybody likes it, and let's see if we can spur a debate. And that's exactly what happened with the Daily Stormer. 8chan is like another, and this is where the nuance to the principles start to come in. Like, this idea that you shouldn't be able to say anything. Like, freedom of speech absolutely has limits. Like, you can't go into a movie theater and yell fire and there's a stampede and people die, and you expect to like be free of consequences because freedom of speech. Like, there is an idea of freedom of speech does have limits, and there are governing rules, but those governing rules are determined by the society in which the speech occurs. And like, that's the whole basis of a democracy. Like, you have a proper process and people think it through. What makes 8chan so difficult was they basically were looking for ways to circumvent the ability to have any restrictions put on them at all. And so they operated in an environment where they were completely unregulated and were enabling things to happen that were clearly bad and that probably would not have, and we can't say for certain because they weren't subject to the jurisdiction, but they've basically gone around jurisdiction shopping such that they were operating in an environment where they weren't being regulated at all. And so the fundamental rules like typically didn't apply. And we were in the very difficult position of being like, we are literally basically the only ones that can do something about this right now. And it appears that there is a clear causal link between what happened in Christchurch and the presence of these folks on the site. And okay, well, they have jurisdiction shopped in order to put themselves in a position where they are literally operating lawlessly, but having impact on all these other societies. There's no rules governing them. That's not a place that we intended to be. Like, we always were like, we work within the laws of the jurisdictions in which we operate. Like, that's always been the operating principle. But they've gone and sought out a jurisdiction where there are no laws and where they can basically do whatever they want. There's no other place in the stack where they can be properly regulated. That leaves the onus on us to act. And that was basically how we came to the decision around HN. It was like, decisions like this are made under pressure. Like, the events of Christchurch happened, and like, it's like, okay, how do we properly think about this? And there's like internal debate, not lots of time, but internal debate on like, okay, what's the appropriate way to act? And like, again, it needs to not just think about it in terms of what are the specifics of the circumstance, but this feels like it needs to be an update to the principle. And the update to the principle is, yes, we operate with a belief in freedom of speech within the limits of the societies that we operate put, and like, we comply with the laws in Germany and US, and everybody has different views around freedom of speech. But if there is a site or a customer that we have that is clearly causing harm and is behaving in such a way to avoid being subject to any of the jurisdictional rules of the places we operate, and there's no one else in the stack that can actually take effect, we are the only ones that can have an impact, then in those circumstances, we may choose to act. And that's what happened with HN.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I think that just hearing that and how it flows with everything else is pretty interesting. I think for others, I'd also say that kind of ties in with the things that, as we all move around our careers, we might find ourselves with. And I think this also ties right into what I guess will be the last question from Cheyenne. So yeah. I guess I can. Yeah, I can. Sorry, I can read it.
I turned off chat.
Yeah, I can read it. So, where should someone draw the line between going with the flow of reality to achieve results and success versus pushing back to influence things in a subjectively better direction?
It's a good question, and it's hard to answer in the abstract. There are a few things that I want to be careful not to conflate. One is going with the flow and conflating going with the flow and reality and pushing back and creating a better place. Like, going with the flow and pushing back is like very much so I talked a little bit at the start around like accepting reality versus like living in an expectations driven world, or living with a projection of the history that you already had and projecting that forward. Like, I feel like what I said there stands. Like, you need to always be blank slating yourself, blank slating the expectations. Okay, I thought I was going to have this holiday, COVID happened, I can be really disappointed, like, or I'm just like, okay, I need to wipe everything and like approach the situation with a fresh set of eyes, understanding the current circumstances. I think that still holds. Going with the flow versus pushing back, this speaks to around principles. And it's like, what are the principles that you have? Like, is this going with the flow because it's like I'm compromising on something that is like, oh, it's not actually that important? Or is this compromising on a fundamental value that I have? And simply, and the other way of viewing this is, and this Steve Jobs quote that I really love, it's like easy to look around the world and assume everything is the way that it is because someone smarter than me designed it and there's some big design. No, like the reason things are the way they are is someone just like you decided to try something and it happened to work. And you can change it. If you think there could be a better way of doing it, it will be work, but you can change it. And so I would frame it in terms of that. If it's like going with the flow versus changing, is like, is it a principle? And don't just look around the world and think about this in terms of like, oh, it's all here because like there's this perfect design and I can't mess with it and I have no contribution to make. This was all created by people that were no smarter than you and I. And if you think there's a better way of doing it, you should absolutely go for it.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a great place to end things. Thank you to everyone who stuck around, but especially thanks to James for joining us again. It's always fun to hear these thoughts. Yeah, if you'd like to end with anything else.
No, I really appreciate you guys, with the exception of Keen, sitting up late to listen to me. I know this is later than your usual class, so I'm super grateful. I'm super grateful for the invite to share and talk to you guys. I realize some of you might be graduating. Some of you might be about to go on summer holidays. I know it's a challenging time. I hope there was something valuable here, and like wish you all the best. If I can ever be helpful, like you can find me online. Don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Yeah, and Zoe will have any last couple announcements for everyone.
No worries. I'm going to drop, guys.
Yeah.
This is great. I really appreciate the opportunity, and like I said, best of luck in the next few months.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, while he leaves, I just wanted to remind everyone that discussion this week will be back to the regular time on Thursday from 3:30 to 4:30, as it has been, same Zoom link. And then the other thing is, I would just ask anyone who is willing, please consider filling out your course evaluations for the class and for Michael as well. But then also for me, there's a separate one for the GSI. I do read all of those, and so I care. So just a general, plea to everyone to please consider doing that. But otherwise, have a good rest of your evening, everyone.
Yeah, please do fill them out. I read them all. If I take on a new course, I start by reading the previous evaluations. I started my first semester at Berkeley with a stack of like a dozen semesters worth of evaluations for multiple courses on my desktop. So they do get used even if you don't realize it, or sometimes they get used semesters afterwards. But they're helpful nonetheless. So thanks again, everyone. This will be it for me and CS195. So hopefully for those of you that are graduating, you enjoy whatever version of graduation happens this semester. And if you're not graduating, then hopefully we can see each other in the fall at some point too. But congrats as well to those of you graduating, whatever you're doing next. Y'all earned it. Y'all earned a break. So take it easy, study for finals, and then go enjoy summer. See you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.